This program, in the Lannan Literary Video Series, and the reading you are about to see were produced by the Lannan Foundation. The Foundation's literary program is dedicated to supporting outstanding contemporary literature and presenting exceptional writers to a wider audience.
I came to New Mexico by way of Indian boarding school. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the northern border of the Creek Nation in the early 50s, early 60s, and then went to Indian boarding school in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I've lived a lot of my life in that area, Navajo country, Hopi land area. And this piece was written, these pieces are taken from a book called Secrets from the Center of the World that was written to go with the photographs of Stephen Strom, who also honors that part of the land. My house is the red earth. It could be the center of the world. I've heard New York, Paris, Tokyo called the center of the world. But I say it is magnificently humble. You could drive by and miss it. Radio waves can obscure it. Words cannot construct it. For there are some sounds left to sacred wordless form. For instance, that fool crow, picking through trash near the corral, understands the center of the world as greasy scraps of fat. Just ask him. He doesn't have to say that the earth has turned scarlet through fierce belief after centuries of heartbreak and laughter. He perches on the blue bowl of the sky and laughs. If you look with the mind of the swirling earth near Shiprock, you become the land beautiful and understand how three crows at the edge of the highway laughing become three crows at the edge of the world laughing. Don't bother the earth spirit who lives here. She is working on a story. It is the oldest story in the world, and it is delicate, changing. If she sees you watching, she'll invite you in for coffee, give you warm bread, and you will be obligated to stay and listen. But this is no ordinary story. You will have to endure earthquakes, lightning, the deaths of all those you love, the most blinding beauty. It's a story so compelling you may never want to leave. This is how she traps you. See that stone finger over there? That is the only one who ever escaped. This next piece is called Grace. Because she was in that place, a moment of grace, a moment when possibility happens. Although usually most moments of grace happen in mundane moments, like you're washing dishes and you look out the window and the light strikes in a certain way and suddenly your heart opens and everything makes perfect sense. One of those moments happened to me in Iowa City, a place I did not like very much. I went to graduate school. It's a beautiful area, but I was going through my own struggles at that time. And it had been a very terrible winter, and I remember sitting in Perkins Cake and Steak one Sunday morning with some friends, and suddenly there was a moment of grace just when we least expected it, and utterly needed it. So grace. I think of wind and her wild ways, the year we had nothing to lose and lost it anyway, in the cursed country of the fox. We still talk about that winter, how the cold froze imaginary buffalo in the stuffed horizon of snowbanks. The haunting voices of the starved and mutilated broke fences, crashed our thermostat dreams, and we couldn't stand it one more time. So once again, we lost a winter in stubborn memory, walked through cheap apartment walls, skated through fields of ghost into a town that never wanted us in the epic search for grace. Like coyote, like rabbit, we could not contain our terror and clowned our way through a season of false midnights. We had to swallow that town so it would go down easy as honey. And one morning, as the sun struggled to break ice, and our dreams had found us with coffee and pancakes in a truck stop along Highway 80, we found grace. I could say Grace was a woman with time on her hands, or a white buffalo escaped from memory. But in that dingy light, it was a promise of balance. We once again understood the talk of animals, and spring was lean and hungry with the hope of children and corn. I would like to say, with Grace, we picked ourselves up and walked into the spring thaw. We didn't. The next season was worse. You went home to Leech Lake to work with the tribe, and I went south and wind. I am still crazy. I know there is something larger than the memory of a dispossessed people. We have seen it. Thank you. I'm going to read some pieces, it's about 4 different pieces about different warriors in this country. One of them was Bird, or Charlie Parker. Incredible warrior. I mean, what do you call a warrior? You know, in my tribe, it's not about taking blood. You know, it's about being able to stand and see something that other people feel but don't always know, or they don't always have the courage to take up the path to get there. And Parker was one of them. Bird. The moon plays horn, leaning on the shoulder of the dark universe to the infinite glitter of chance. Tonight I watched Bird kill himself, larger than real life. I've always had a theory that some of us were born with nerve endings longer than our bodies, out to here, farther than his convoluted scales could reach. Those nights he played, did he climb the stairway of forgetfulness with his horn, a woman who is always beautiful to strangers. All poets understand the final uselessness of words. We are chords to other chords to other chords, if we're lucky, to melody. The moon is brighter than anything I can see when I come out of the theater. Then music, then memory of music, or any mere poem. At least I can dance to ornithology or sweet talk beside Charlie's blues. But inside this poem, I can't play a horn, hijack a plane to somewhere where music is the place those nerve endings dangle. Each rhapsody embodies counterpoint, and pain stuns the woman in high heels, the man behind the horn. To survive is sometimes a leap into madness. The fingers of saints are still hot from miracles, but can they save themselves? Where is the dimension a God lives, who will take Bird home? I want to see it, I said to the Catalinas, to the Rincones. To anyone listening in the dark, I said, let me hear you, by any means, by horn, by fever, by night, even by some poem attempting flight home. Thank you. This is for Jim Pepper. He was quite an innovator. He was Muskogee Creek, his mother's Creek, and his father's Kaw, Indian. And he grew up listening to Muskogean music and also Southern Plains music, and learned the music and the dances. And somewhere in there, he got hooked on jazz and began playing saxophone. and was doing something that nobody had really done up to that point, and this was also with the urging of Don Cherry, was to mix tribal elements of music with jazz. Now, I think jazz is a tribal music, and it comes out of basically African tradition, but nobody ever speaks about Muskogees being part of that process. But think about it, you know, we were there in that process. But he became a brother, and if you saw him, you could also see that he was a bear. And I wrote this piece to honor him and his family after he passed away at a very young age, you know, and it's called "The Place the Musician Became a Bear." And when I read this, I want you to think about, I am trying to get across that sense of, you know, at home in the ceremonial grounds at the stomp dance and the green corn, when people have been dancing and the turtle shells are going all night, and then there's at dawn, that gray right before dawn, it stops. And you know how it is, everybody's been in places where people sing together and play together, and when it stops, the whole world resonates with that sound, and then the sun comes up. So over here is that sound in Oklahoma, where you can also hear those insects and everything just alive. And over here is the subway. That's also a music, a valid music, and a valid experience. And both of these things were in and are in his music because it goes on. The place the musician became a bear. I think of the lush stillness of the end of a world, sung into place by singers and the rattle of turtles in the dark morning. When embers from the sacred middle are climbing out the other side of stars, when the moon has stomp danced with us from one horizon to the next, such a soft awakening. Our souls imitate lights in the Milky Way. We've always known where to go to become ourselves again in the human comedy. It's the how that baffles. A saxophone can complicate things. You knew this, as do all musicians, when the walk becomes a necessary dance to fuel the full heart. Or the single complicated human becomes a wave of humanness and forgets to be ashamed of making the wrong step. I'm talking about an early morning in Brooklyn. The streets, the color of ashes. Do you see the connection? It's not as if the stars forsake us. We forget about them, or remake the pattern in a field of white crystal, or of some other tricky fate. We never mistook ourselves for anything but human. The wings of the Milky Way lead back to the singers, and there's the saxophone again. It's about rearranging the song to include the subway hiss under your feet in Brooklyn, and the laugh of a bear who thought he was a human, as he plays that tune again, the one about the wobble of the earth spinning so damned hard it hurts. Okay. And this is a poem to get rid of fear. It's called I Give You Back. I release you, my beautiful and terrible fear. I release you. You were my beloved and hated twin, but now I don't know you as myself. I release you with all the pain I would know at the death of my children. You are not my blood anymore. I give you back to the soldiers who burned down my home, beheaded my children, raped and sodomized my brothers and sisters. I give you back to those who stole the food from our plates when we were starving. I release you, fear, because you hold these scenes in front of me, and I was born with eyes that can never close. I release you. I release you. I release you. I release you. I am not afraid to be angry. I am not afraid to rejoice. I am not afraid to be hungry. I am not afraid to be full. I am not afraid to be black. I am not afraid to be white. I am not afraid to be hated. I am not afraid to be loved, to be loved, to be loved, to be loved, to be loved. Fear. Oh, you have choked me, but I gave you the leash. You have gutted me, but I gave you the knife. You have devoured me, but I laid myself across the fire. I take myself back, fear. You are not my shadow any longer. I won't hold you in my hands. You can't live in my eyes, my ears, my voice, my belly, or in my heart, my heart, my heart. But come here, fear. I am alive, and you are so afraid of dying. I'm going to read two more. This one's called Perhaps the World Ends Here. Now, I think the center of the world is really the kitchen table. That's where all the action is. And you can tell the state of the union by how far away we are from that kitchen table. The world begins at a kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to live. The gifts of earth are brought and prepared, set on the table. So it has been since creation, and it will go on. We chase chickens or dogs away from it. Babies teethe at the corners. They scrape their knees under it. It is here that children are given instructions on what it means to be human. We make men at it. We make women. At this table we gossip, recall enemies and the ghosts of lovers. Our dreams drink coffee with us as they put their arms around our children. They laugh with us at our poor falling down selves and as we put ourselves back together once again at the table. This table has been a house in the rain, an umbrella in the sun. Wars have begun and ended at this table. It is a place to hide in the shadow of terror, a place to celebrate the terrible victory. At this table, we sing with joy, with sorrow. We pray of suffering and remorse. We give thanks. Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table, while we are laughing and crying, eating of the last sweet bite. Thank you. And this is Eagle Poem, which is a prayer. And I want to thank you all for coming out and supporting poetry. And this is a prayer for all of us. To pray, you open your whole self to sky, to earth, to sun, to moon, to one whole voice that is you. And know there is more that you can't see, can't hear, can't know except in moments steadily growing. And in languages that aren't always sound, but other circles of motion. Like eagle, that Sunday morning over Salt River, circled in blue sky and wind, swept our hearts clean with sacred wings. We see you, see ourselves, and know that we must take the utmost care and kindness in all things. Breathe in, knowing we are made of all this, and breathe, knowing we are truly blessed because we were born and die soon, within a true circle of motion, like eagle, rounding out the morning inside us. We pray, that it will be done in beauty, in beauty. Thank you. Thank you. Every day is a reenactment of the creation story. We emerge from dense, unspeakable material through the shimmering power of dreaming stuff. This is the first world and the last. Ourselves for television, the box that separates a dreamer from the dreaming. It was as if we were stolen, put into a bag, carried on the back of a white man who pretends to own the earth and the sky. In the sack were all the people of the world. We fought till there was a hole in the bag. When we fell, we were not aware of falling. To work or to the mall. The children were in school learning subtraction with guns. We found ourselves somewhere near the diminishing point of civilization, not far from the trickster's bag of tricks. Everything was as we imagined it. The earth and stars, every creature and leaf imagined with us. When we fell, we were not aware of falling. We were driving to work or to the mall. The children were in school learning subtraction with guns. The imagining needs praise, as does any living thing. We are evidence of this praise. And when we laugh, we're indestructible. No story or song will translate the full impact of falling, or the inverse power of rising up, of rising up, of rising up. Our children put down their guns when we did, to imagine with us. We imagined the shining link between the heart and the sun. We imagine tables of food for everyone. We imagine the songs. The imagination, conversely, illumined us, spoke with us, sang with us, danced with us, drummed with us, loved us.
There's so many things that we want to talk about. Joy and I had lunch today. We've visited before and during the break, and we kept saying to each other, these are the things we should talk about. These are the things we should talk about. So one of the things I've been talking to you about, Joy, is the whole notion in your poetry about breaking barriers as a way to freedom. I know in the poem, Two Horses, you wrote, there are two moons on the horizon, and for you I have broken loose. It seems that so often that in order to love or to understand, we have to break through things. It's about breaking through things. And I see that again and again in your poetry. Do you want to say something about breaking? Or
I think we all go through tests as human beings, and probably one of the largest tests I've had to go through is, breaking through, certainly as a human to find myself as an Indian in this country, breaking through what the country's mythological American dream construct to find myself in a place that would identify me as something. I'm like Pocahontas, like Pocahontas, for instance. There we go. It's another touchy. But I don't know, I see life as a series of cycles, and every cycle has its breakdown. I mean, every cycle has a period of resonance, of growth, of creativity, and then there's a breakdown to the cycle, and a breakthrough if you keep going. And I think that's what poetry has taught me, I think. Poetry and music more recently is how to break through and how to make it through, because I didn't start out to be a poet, as a little kid growing up in Oklahoma. I didn't see a lot of, poets around me, or Indian poets, or, Indian women poets for that matter, although I'm related to Alexander Posey, who was a really fine Creek poet at the turn of the century. But I didn't, really, in my presence and around me, I didn't see that particular place. But poetry came to me and said, when I was about in my early 20s and going through a period of great testing, poetry looked at me and just shook its head and said, "You poor thing, you don't have any grace. You don't know how to listen. You don't know how to talk, and you really need me." And so I'm going to take you, because that was the last thing I thought I was going to do. I came from a family of painters. My grandmother Naomi Harjo was a painter. My Aunt Lois Harjo was a painter. And I was going to be, a painter, an artist. That was a place that that's a place that felt comfortable. But the idea of speaking in public, speaking in a class where I always sat in the back if I could and felt very uncomfortable speaking, and listening again. I had a problem with listening and kept getting into these scenarios and situations. And poetry has taken me and taught me how to break through, even my own, weaknesses, and break through the language. I mean, the question I think that what we have to deal with as Indian artists is how do we take our, what we know, what is given to us from our tribes, and what we know from LA, for instance, and from movies and from the literature that comes from Europe and other influences.
Breaking through, it's important. You brought up an interesting point about Indian identity, and that's one of the things that we're constantly having to define in the face of those who are defining what that is, i.e. Pocahontas. I know I was telling you at lunch, so many people say to me, "Oh, you're Indian, you must be into nature." And I always say, "Aren't you? You're breathing, aren't you?" I guess more importantly on the topic, Joy, is that I've taught anthologies of American Indian poetry, and it's very interesting how they've chosen your poems and the poems of other American Indian artists, and it's always around the themes of nature or protest or identity. And I said, for example, never about sex. We don't kiss, we don't have sex. And so one of the things that I was interested in is having my students read a volume of your poetry and then seeing from that volume what has been anthologized. And you, in your work, break through that. Do you want to talk a little bit about those confines?
It'd be a real revolution for people to see Indian people as human beings. That might sound ridiculous or crazy or even a little far-fetched, but think about it. How have Indians been seen in this country? Usually as some false prototype of a Plains male, and the stories almost always end at destruction, at a point considered of destruction. So and you rarely see Indian women, and you rarely see, you don't see families, you don't see, we didn't have just men at the turn of the century, and there's, it's like anybody else. Look at your own families. Everybody look at your own families. There's all kinds of intrigue and all manner of stories, all manner of rich stories going on. And I think that would be something that would, to be able to break through that and be human and recognized as human rather than some force frozen in time. It's safe to keep us frozen in time, you know that. It's very safe, because if Indian people are frozen and remain at the turn of the century, then that means that we're not really here. If we're not sitting here wearing what we would wear during our tribal ceremonies or in particular times, then it's safe. Then we're not really here. If we don't look like those images, then we're not really here, and that's not so. Then things didn't really happen. Then everything is history, and history has nothing to do with us, but history is right here in everybody's face and everybody's heart, and it doesn't stop and end, but it's ongoing and it's circular, and we're in it, and we're in it together. Indian history is not about just Indian people. It's about America and who we all are together. Now, I don't know why this happened. I don't know why there was the European invasion. I don't know why there was slavery. I don't know why all of this happened. I don't know why the Indian people have been tested so hard. I figure that's because we're strong, and that we're being tested because we can make it. I don't know why, but the point is we're all here right now, and what are we going to, we have to learn. I think, what I'm getting is that, it's about respect and learning how to make sense, a beautiful and terrible sense of this place and time, and have a good time too at the same time, together.
One of the things that we're tested, American Indian people are certainly tested by and with, and certainly all people, not just us, Joy, is that whole notion of internalized oppression. So many of us in many ways have internalized the values of the dominator, have felt badly about ourselves. That's been manifested in the alcoholism and the parts of our lives that our parents don't want us to talk about openly. You talk about these things openly. And your poem, I Give You Back, is about confronting that fear, that internalized hate, and almost a mantra saying, I'm not going to fall in the face of you. It's almost a prayer for all of us. How did that come about, that poem? So many people have been moved by that. Do you want to talk about that a little?
I knew that at that time I was going through a lot confronting a lot of fears. But I was so young at that time, I was thinking recently that I really wasn't, that poem was larger than me, as all poems are, and it was something I needed to know. But for the first time tonight, I think I remember partly what that came out of. And I was down at Sacaton on the Gila River Indian Reservation working with students, and I remember the kids talking about how people looked at them when they would go to the store and not touch their hands if they were giving them change back, or not, they wouldn't touch their hands, or they would treat them badly in a way that would make them put their heads down when they would go out into the world and not want to interact because of that kind of disrespect. And I remember telling them, saying, it's not about you, and that's the most difficult thing to do when you see it, in the world all around you when you're outside your home, is it's not about you. It's about someone else's weakness or inability. And I think that's too what that poem came out of, is trying to find a way for these students and these young people and the young person within me and with all of us to handle that kind of fear and to handle that fear.
To name it.
Yeah.
Everybody, of course, I know countless people who've interviewed you talk about your influences. Your family, certainly the stories you've heard, the cultural stories, and of course other American Indian writers, Leslie Marmon Silko. But then there's been others. There's been Richard Hugo, Adrienne Rich, Audre Lorde. So in so many ways your poetry is in fact a synthesis, a cultural synthesis, much the way jazz as a genre of music is. Would you talk a little bit about the synthesis?
When I first started writing, I think, out of a response to what was going on in Native communities in the early 70s, which was a national movement towards recognizing, much like the Black Power movement that was going on. It was a national recognition of people saying suddenly, well, it's okay to be Indian. I mean, that was a major revelation because our parents had gone through major shame and reduction of sense of self. And so I started writing in the early 70s, and I was around a community that was, there were a lot of Indian writers. I was in New Mexico at the time. There was Mama Day was around, Leslie Silko, Simon Ortiz, and others. And then I started looking for poetry, and the poetry that really, I think, really moved me and got me even more into writing were the African American writers. And so then I went to look up African writers, and then Irish writers and Irish American, and was part of a whole kind of multicultural literary uprising, I think, that was beginning around that time. And it was around people who influenced me very much. But I also have to address the music because that's very much a part of it. Poetry, I think, was born, at least in my tribe, you don't have people declaiming poetry by themselves. It's songs. It's with songs, and there's music and even dance that goes with it. And so when I think about poetry, the history of poetry, I have to think about people like Jim Pepper, Patsy Cline, who my mother used to sing Patsy Cline songs, and I love heartbreak songs, no matter, no matter whether they're Kiowa 49 songs or Patsy Cline or John Coltrane. And one of the most intense experiences that ever happened to me was when it was around the time I was acquiring language. And before that time, there's so much that gets set into place in the psychic field of a child. And we were in Tulsa, and Tulsa's very hot and humid in the summer. And we were driving, and it was before seat belts. And I'm standing behind my father, who had thick, dark hair and smelled like Old Spice. I can remember that smell of Old Spice shaving cream. And I love music. I always loved jukeboxes. And there were times growing up and going to school when I'd have a quarter and I'd have to choose between a jukebox and buying a Coke, and I'd usually go for the jukebox. But I was standing behind him, and I was probably about 3. And this music came on the radio, and it was a jazz trumpet player. From here, it seems like it's Miles Davis, because he's one of the few trumpets that I can really move with. But I don't know if they were playing Miles Davis much or who they were playing in the early 50s there. And I went into this space where suddenly I was no longer a child, but I was larger, into that mind that is larger than all of it. And I could see my parents, and I could see the world, and there was a compassion. And it also triggered in me a great love for this music that could move into those kinds of spaces.
Certainly the poetry as you've conceived it in your mind is about music and lyricism and all. When did you take up the sax? When did you begin playing the horn? I mean, you literally picked up music and have now are working to integrate it into your performances as a poet and as a musician.
I didn't start playing until about 8-9 years ago. And I'd always wanted to play. I played clarinet for about a year or 2 when I was a kid. I didn't have any private lessons. I think I played on the same reed the whole time. I didn't know. That's all right. and then gave it up. I remember going in and the music teacher said, "We have an alto sax here. Who wants to play it?" I was the first one with my hand up, and the teacher said, "Girls can't play saxophone." So I quit. I got mad and just quit and came to it years later in my 30s. And for me, it's like singing. I'd always wanted to be able to sing like Aretha Franklin or somebody, you know. It's my singing voice, and it's a very demanding. It's like taking up another kind of art. But again, what I'm doing with the band, which to me is really exciting, is mixing all of these elements of tribal musics. Because we had the tape music you were hearing was with my band Poetic Justice. And we're mixing there's elements of Hopi music, elements of Navajo music, elements of Northern Plains, with elements of jazz, rock, reggae, soca even, and so on. Because, all of us in the band, there's 6 band members in all. Susan Williams, John Williams, who are Sisseton, Wahpeton, Dakota, Frank Pucha, who's Hopi and Pima, Will Johnson, who's Isleta and Navajo, and Richard Carbajal, who's Hispanic. And, this music reflects all that we are, And Indian people have always been multidimensional. Again, there's still that stereotype lens. But people are people, there's trade routes. I think it's the most preposterous thing that our universities for years have been teaching, that there was a land bridge and it was marked one way. That's strange. And you have whole anthropology departments of native studies, anthropology departments who are still teaching this, and they want to believe it. But have you ever seen such a thing? I mean, can you imagine? Of course, human beings are human beings. People are going to go 2 ways,
Well, I always love people always say, "Oh, you came over the Bering Strait," and I always say, "No, but we have our bearing straight." Yeah. You talk about the mixing of genres and of course, poetry you write in English. And your music is influenced, a mixture of African, American, and so on. Your poetry itself begins to change form. It's also not static. And I think that's what we're talking about the work, that art is about culture as process, in motion. Yeah. And itself, it doesn't move. For instance, your most recent collection, The Woman Who Fell from the Sky, you've done something you haven't done in your former books, and that is, at the end of each poem, you have sort of a continuance that's in italics that contextualizes the poem, that almost comments on it, where it's from, how you thought about it. How did that come about, Joy, and why?
That whole book was a certain kind of concept. I mean, because there was also a tape. It's the first time Norton had done this, and it was quite a new idea. It was to market a tape of the reading with just a little bit of music, not very much on it, of the oral performance. And that's really important to me, because certainly I feel like I do come out of an oral tradition, oral traditions, and everybody does ultimately. And then I also write the poetry. I also write it to be read, and all to be read on the page, but also to be spoken. I mean, sound and rhythm and words the sound of words and the music of words has always been really important to me. And I also realized that in a performance, because I wanted the book to be a performance too, as you saw, I usually talk a little bit before each one. I don't just get up and proclaim them and not say anything. And so I wanted the book to be like performance also. And so there are stories that link, stories much as the ones I would tell in here, and during a performance, as well as the taped live performance, to kind of take it out of just being a book to being a performance too, and also to be recognized oral tradition as a base as well as written.
Current work, you're working on a collection of essays, of nonfiction. You're working on another collection of poetry. You're certainly working on your music, but you're also editing a book of American Indian women writers. Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk about the process of editing? You're doing some new things, and you've had some problems with editors, with keeping that book alive. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I was going to say, no, I don't. Well, it's been, it was a book that we were going to have done in 1992. It's 19. It will be out. It will be out October 1996 from Norton, and it's an anthology of Native women's writing called Reinventing the Enemy's Language, contemporary Native women's writing. And it's mostly Canada and the U.S., and I've been working on it with Gloria Bird in particular, who's Spokane Indian, really fine writer and thinker, who we also went to high school, the Indian boarding school together years back. And we also edited it with Patricia Blanco, Beth Cuthand, and Valerie Martinez. We've had to think about it. We've thought a lot about what we wanted in this collection, and we wanted it to be a collection that was truly representative of Indian women writers, and most Indian women writers aren't in academic institutions. But a lot of what happens so often with these anthologies, they are marketed and put together by publishers for academic institutions, and they usually follow a particular form, and we decided that we really wanted it to be representative. So a lot of the writers aren't people whose names you would hear every day, but they really, I think we feel really good about its representation. But we've had to go through a lot about, what is a Native literary criticism? Is there such a thing? And I think the telling thing in the end is we wanted it to be able to be used in the community and have sense in the community, because so much out there that's written is fine if you're out in the academic world. It makes sense there, but are people at home, does it make sense, at home as well as out here? Because this is, we want to speak to everyone too, but it needs to have a context and a place, at home, and that's crucial, I think.
I have a very selfish concern and question, something that I like that you seem to use a lot of and notice a lot of in your world: crows, blackbirds.
Crows and blackbirds. Well, I usually see them almost everywhere, and they are they're tricksters. They're tricksters, and they laugh a lot, and they seem to have a particular viewpoint of the world. They can see everything because they're usually near the trash. They're scavengers, and to be a scavenger, I guess you have to understand human beings, and what they leave behind.
You have to watch them. You have to know them.
Yeah.
And they seem to know us better than we know ourselves. They can predict us so well. At lunch we were talking about there's a part of you that would just like to stay home and dream and write and not have to keep going out and performing and talking and teaching, but you keep doing it.
It's what I'm supposed to do. I mean, I enjoy this. I enjoy talking with people and performing and so on. But yeah, there is a part of me. I mean, I'm really happy when I'm home and listening to stories and listening to the knowledge that people have of the deepest kind. I could sit in those places and just listen and go into those kinds of stories and places, but that's not my job in this life. My job is I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, even though I fight it sometimes. I think I'm doing what I'm supposed to do.
I think most of us would agree. One last question, to go back, Joy, to the beginning. The whole question about breaking through, and I'm sure you often imagine a world where many of us have broken through or are breaking through. What would that world be like?
I've often thought about theories of communication. I'm thinking about it a lot now because we're moving from being literary, predominantly literary, at least out here, and I guess what I'm thinking is a place in which lies, there's no place for lying. In writing, you can, you look at, National Enquirer is, an extreme example, but you can look and see how it's very easy to lie in writing unless you're writing poetry or something that demands a lot from your soul. But a lot of people, you see all kinds of tell-alls, this or that or the other. There's a lot of room for lying in words and writing things down. Even in images, you can lie very well in images. I mean, look at Indian people in movies. And the thing with images too, moving images, you can it can happen. They can either provoke you and take you deeper inside yourself, or what so often happens is they start imagining for you, and then you begin to have a generation of children who use that mode of discourse primarily and are no longer able to imagine for themselves. And then I think about speaking to you right now and how we're speaking with each other and with you as our, song performance, telling stories and interacting with each other as our families, everybody's family did before the invention of the printing press. And, you can feel each other, you can see people's eyes, you can see their souls, there's an interaction that's unlike anything else. And then I think about breaking through, and I think about that place that happens, like listening to that jazz trumpet solo, or communing with people sometimes, and there's a place in which there are no words needed, there's no artifice, there's no lying, there's utter truth and utter beauty at that moment of connection. And that's what I think about breaking through, is to be able to find that place in any situation you're in. In these times it's hard sometimes. It's a very difficult time to be able to sift through and find that place that you're in.
Joy, certainly some of your poems, the ones you've read tonight and others, would seem to me to be prayers or passages that give us a glimmer of that world. And thanks a lot for sharing with us tonight.
Thank you.